Welcome all to this session. So today, obviously, we're going to talk about detection drift and configuration drift and why it's important to really kind of make sure that what you assume you've got for coverage in your kind of security operations and your detection environment is actually comes true to life. So we're going to jump into that. So we're going to kind of walk through what these simulations reveal and kind of how it kind of fits in with traditional testing and how threat actors exploit those drifts and configuration shifts in kind of in layered defenses. But before we kind of jump into that, I'll pass over to Ronan to give himself a quick introduction.
Hi, Dom. Thank you very much. I'm Ronan Lavelle. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Validato. And as you'll probably find out later today in this session, we are a threat simulation platform. We work very closely with ETE and their customer base to test threats and improve detections and find opportunities to better protect and build resilience against those threats.
Thank you, Roddy. Yeah, so I'm Dominic Carroll. I'm the Director of Portfolio at E2E Assure, so I lead the services strategy and the roadmap for our business. E2E Assure is a specialist threat detection response services provider, delivering advanced monitoring services to detect and contain cyber criminal activity within our clients' digital infrastructure. So we have a mission to innovate faster than cyber criminals and break their business model by making our clients too hard a target. And so how we go about that, you'll see some of that during the course of this session. Diving in, obviously big issues of the day in cyber. Ransomware has been around for well over 10 years. It's not going away, and there's a reason it's not going away, and it's very profitable for cyber criminals, and also for nation states that kind of wish to cause chaos. Often they'll continue to sponsor and kind of facilitate these cyber criminals just to kind of provide a distraction for their objectives as well. And obviously, this is the latest stat from the Verizon data breach investigation report. 44% of organizations being held hostage. It continues to increase. The methods of operation continue to change, and in some cases get more sophisticated. But when we're focusing on cyber criminals, obviously their key focus is extorting money. And what you want to do is obviously detect cyber criminal activity before that happens, and obviously the whole range of activities in the cybersecurity lifecycle for end user awareness training, building your defenses, making sure your compliance is up to date. But obviously we focus on making sure we can detect when attackers are focusing on a particular business, and we can kind of contain that and eradicate them as early as possible in the attacker lifecycle, which we're kind of going to go into some detail. And that kind of graph on the right of this slide kind of shows why it's, from a financial perspective, why it's important to kind of detect as early as possible. Because any kind of breach into your environment constitutes an incident, and the kind of cleanup of that incident will vary in cost depending on how far the attackers manage to get into your environment. So there's different stages. So if you kind of catch them early on at what we call initial access, cleanup costs are relatively low. But as they move through, if they get all the way to ransomware and they hold your, they've kind of got access to your target data, and they kind of encrypted that and are threatening to release it, obviously there's costs significant in terms of having to maybe rebuild IT systems and all the crisis management and everything else. So that's the breach cleanup cost figure there at the bottom, that 5% to 25%. Those comes from like some of the insurance analysis figures, and that's a massive range, and it's the kind of unhelpful range. But that kind of just goes to show that at the low end, if you catch them early, you can probably keep your costs well below 5% of your revenue. But at the high end, if you get fully ransomware, and you kind of have to rebuild your IT infrastructure from scratch and manage all the fallout from around that. That's a significant cost for the business. Ronan, I know there's kind of some views you had on that. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Thanks, Dom. Sure. I think first thing is that I think we are at a cusp in the industry, a huge inflection point where the offensive use of AI, particularly in ransomware, is going to become much more prevalent. So I think we are literally scratching the surface. And there's some data published recently that show that 2024 was a bad year in ransomware, $42 billion worth of breach cleanup costs. But in 2031, it's estimated to be $265 billion. So to Dom's point, this is not going away. It's going to get significantly worse. And the onus is on everyone on today's call, but everyone also in different industries and countries to stress test their environments against this particular threat and also other cyber threats, and just make sure that your own house is in order and you're able to detect, you're able to protect yourself against these kind of threats.
Brilliant. Yeah, and so obviously, yeah, I mean, to that point in terms of how severe the cleanup costs can be, if that attack gets all the way through into the business, as we've seen in some kind of recent high-profile incidents, it can result in a complete downtime for the business. And in that case, we're kind of entering what we call a disaster scenario. Now, a lot of businesses plan for disaster scenarios. They have business continuity and disaster recovery planning, and this is kind of a standard framework for that, made up of 3 layers: so infrastructure management and policy layers, about how much downtime the business can take on board, how they kind of go about assessing that, plans to put contingency plans in place, and how that's delivered through the infrastructure. So that's the policy management and infrastructure piece. But we tend not to think of that so much in the cyber environment. We're all kind of used to doing, we're all in offices all the time doing fire drills, and the IT team would do different site failover scenarios. But understanding, what the impacts of you're getting through to a breach and kind of putting that into that process is not necessarily a mature part of everyone's setup at the moment. Now, obviously, cybersecurity runs through this entire model. Obviously, we can talk, but it's different levels of physical, IT, and cybersecurity. So, a lot of times, IT security and cybersecurity are rolled into one, but they are kind of differing perspectives on the same thing. So it's for the cybersecurity perspective, that's more kind of threat led. What are the threats to the business? It more feeds into the management layer at risk management, and then the kind of the contingencies for that, the kind of mitigation measures, are delivered through the infrastructure layer, typically by the IT security team. Now, this kind of the box you see on the right, taken from a presentation from Microsoft and IDC about preparing for NIS2. So NIS2 is a European standard for cybersecurity resilience. We've also got other standards like DORA, which is very much about operational resilience. So all these things are starting to merge together, and there's other incoming ones. In the UK, there's the Cyber Resilience Act, and Ronan, I know you've got a fairly deep insight to a lot of these things and the impacts they're having. Can you speak to this in terms of what you're seeing?
Absolutely, Dom. Thank you. I think, again, it's all change in the regulatory and legislation environment around cyber resilience. So really led from the EU with DORA and NIS2, but very rapidly coming to the UK at the end of this year, we think, with the Cybersecurity and Resilience Act. But they all essentially are saying the same thing. They're basically changing the onus on us as organizations who may fall within industries that are regulated or under this legislation, from a position of audit-based point-in-time assessments and compliance, like the ISO 2701 type environment or NIST 853, to much more of a continuous compliance onus. So obviously, none of us know when or if we're going to be hit with a cyber incident, but it is at that exact point in time that we need to demonstrate compliance to things like the UK Cybersecurity Act and Resilience Act and NIS 2 and DORA. So the only really practical way to do that is automation, and is to stress test your environment on a regular basis safely using simulation and testing. So, other industries have used simulation for many years. The F1 teams train in simulators. Pilots train in simulators, and we're simply adding the same capability to cyber defense. It's a much more effective way to test your defenses in simulated and safe environments rather than when you're actually stressed out in an actual incident. So it's become much more regular, much more frequent, and part of our cyber defense strategy going forward.
Brilliant, thanks, Ronan. So, in terms of, obviously, we have highlighted the validation and testing piece of that framework there, and obviously we're going to dive deep into that. But before we kind of get into how your platform delivers that, it's going to do a quick whistle-stop tour of detections, what they are, how we go about building scenarios, just to kind of make sure everyone's kind of on that same page. So obviously it starts detections, obviously, in terms of looking at different signals that are happening within your IT infrastructure and sometimes external to that as well. There's different levels of sophistication, and this is a model that's been commonly used for quite a while called the pyramid of pain. Unfortunately, it's about implementing pain on the attacker and not us. And that pain is financial pain because attackers operate. There's an underground cyberground economy. They all kind of pass services between each other, and there's like a underground value chain. So, in order to deliver a return on their investment for the cyber criminals, they kind of use repeatable processes, repeatable tools, and we refer to these as techniques, tools, and procedures. So this model shows a hierarchy of sophistication of detections within your environment. So at the bottom, hash values are file names and IP addresses. If you're just trying to detect adversary activity just based on those, the attacker sees you as a fairly easy target, a trivial target, because it's easy for them to modify those parameters, those values, continue operating in the same way. When we start building detections based on the tools they use, the kind of techniques, their kind of modus operandi, it becomes much more expensive for them to kind of redefine how they're going to work, and they need to invest in different tools and kind of new ways of working, and that's not what they want to do. So if you've got that capability in your environment, an attacker manages to kind of get into your environment and you detect them straight away, they'll probably just move on, because unless you are a nation state, your common cyber criminal will not kind of rebuild their ways of working to get to you unless you get a really big payout. And it's only the nation state type attackers that kind of go down that path. So just looking at kind of what that means then. So this is all kind of documented in something called the MITRE attack framework. And that's a big catalogue of these different threat actors, the tactics they use, the techniques and the tools that they're using to get that. So you can kind of understand for different types of attack path what it is you need to be looking for. And at an abstracted level, I've pulled a few kind of tactics out of the MITRE attack framework. And then it kind of moving kind of into your organization. Credential identity theft is a very common means of kind of getting, using phishing, for example, and the sophisticated end of how to social engineer users and IT help desk to kind of get valid credentials to then kind of get access into your environment. And once they're in, that's when they'll start moving around and looking for access to other accounts, which gives them further access to much more sensitive systems. And if they get then access to their target, which is generally data, that's when they'll start deploying the ransomware tools, encrypting the data, start exfiltrating. And there's different kind of threat actor groups involved in this. So initial access brokers, they're the kind of expertise in kind of these sophisticated techniques to trick organizations into giving away credentials, and obviously they've also got skills in identifying vulnerabilities. It's the affiliates that tend to run ransomware campaigns. But they'll buy access from initial access brokers, they'll buy ransomware tools from ransomware as a service providers. So we think about recent media events, hear about like Dragon Force and Scattered Spider. So Scattered Spider would be the affiliates in this case, a ransomware service provider, Dragon Force, and that's that underground value chain. So Ronan, so there's different ways of detecting all this activity across the chain. But Ronan, you've noticed something that really interesting in kind of the work you've done about where best to focus, where it's easiest and more kind of productive to focus your efforts.
So Validato has done a lot of research and work into how adversaries perform their tradecraft. What are they actually doing inside a Windows, Linux, or Mac environment? And the dirty little secret out there is that many threat actors, particularly within criminal classifications like ransomware, actually share very common behaviors and techniques. I think to your point, Dom, because they are commercially orientated, they actually go after the things that are easiest for them to exploit. So there are, a subset of these MITRE attack techniques within your Windows and Linux environments that are targeted more often than others, and therefore these are the ones that we particularly advise our customers and through E2E to improve detections on. So we're seeing visibility of adversarial behaviors, and we're able to lock down those environments where necessary to disrupt that attack chain and that attack path. So absolutely, it's very much a subset.
Great stuff. Before we kind of look a bit deeper into that platform, let's kind of going to go another level down into why it's kind of really important to get your detections really tuned and working well and being able to disrupt early in the attacker lifecycle. So in a kind of what I call a legacy SOC operation, often endpoint agents might be deployed on desktops and there might be a SIEM in place, but if those are just kind of deployed out of the box, so the endpoint agent rules are not tuned, the SIEM analysis that collects all the different telemetry from the devices is not tuned where it needs to be. If an attacker does get initial access, so they've got something else, they've managed to phish a user and they've got that user's credentials, it might be detected, but if it's not kind of sending the right priority of alerts, if it's like a medium or a low, then it just looks suspicious. Security operations, tend to be kind of very, very busy. There's lots of different alerts happening. So if it's not flagged as a critical, which it should be if there's an attacker in the environment, then that gives the attacker plenty of time to move laterally through the infrastructure and look for better privileges while this kind of log is sitting there, this alert is sitting there waiting for attention. And once the attackers do have, they've kind of managed to find their target data and they're ready to deploy the ransomware, then it's a bit of a smash and grab. So they'll kind of set up the kind of what we call a command and control environment, and that will typically then be alerted as a critical alert. But at this point, that's when your kind of more traditional legacy SOC will kind of the SLA kicks in for someone to say they need to kind of look at this, and in the meantime, the attacker could have exfiltrated, encrypted the data, and before the SOC escalation kit has kicked in. So my little kind of catchphrase logo there is at that point, it's you kind of close the stable door after the horse has bolted. You need to be tuning those detections and making sure you contain that as soon as the initial access is kicked in. And obviously that's the way we work with our clients. So we tune all their kind of detections, any endpoint software, the EDR software they're using is kind of constantly kind of tuned and tweaked to kind of remove false positives, to kind of make sure the really high impact events are flagged to the SOC critically, and where possible automatically implement containment. Ronan, anything else you want to add to that before we move on to looking at the platform? Because obviously what we want to be testing as part of the kind of attack simulation is making sure that we can kind of pick things up here to stop them, and that the containment that we're kind of putting in place is doing what it says on the tin.
Yeah, I think the only point I'd like to make here, I think, is a timeline thing. I think operationally within say the management of a SOC, you're looking at the current timeline to like today, and therefore it's very IOC focused. I think when you also want to look at preventative measures to prepare yourself for what if analysis in the future, you need to also consider behaviors, which is why obviously your point about MITRE attack is very valuable and useful, because it's a really great knowledge base to base future-based scenario testing on, which is very much where Validato plays.
Great stuff. So let's kind of look at that in a bit more detail.
Thank you. So I'm actually going to do this interactively if I can share my screen. So hopefully we can see this. And to Dom's point about some of the UK media has been publishing some incidents that have been quite widely shared and publicized within the retail sector, but also other sectors also, where you have threat actor groups or affiliates like Scattered Spider, but also the tool sets that they use. And some of these tool sets actually and indeed the threat actors have been around for a little time. So, there were threat advisories issued by the United States in 2023 about Scattered Spider, for instance. We've hearing a lot about Dragon Force as a ransomware platform that they use, but also, they've been using Black Cat for some time also. So these tools are out there. But I think what we do in Validato is we are a simulation platform, and we want to make sure that both your partner with ETE, but also yourselves, your own IT and security teams, don't need to unnecessarily stress out every time a new threat is publicized or made known, because what we want to get you to is a level of confidence and trust in your resilience against a wide range of threat-based behaviors. So the Validator platform has many, many threat scenarios built into it, but I want to focus today on a much more high-level category around ransomware in general, because Dom has mentioned MITRE attack a couple of times today, and MITRE attack, if you are not familiar, is what we're based on as a platform also. But it's a really awesome, I see it as like an academic project that is articulating all of the possible permutations that an adversary could use in order to compromise a Windows, Linux, or Mac environment, or indeed a cloud environment. And all these little gray boxes down here are all functions of those platforms that could be manipulated across the attacker lifecycle or kill chain. And what we're actually seeing, if I just go back here, superimposed in blue, are actually the MITRE attack techniques with like the behaviors that not one threat actor group, but the top 10 ransomware groups are commonly exploiting. So our point earlier about 80-20, so 80% of threat actor groups use 20% of Windows and Linux functions or MITRE attack techniques. It may not be scientifically accurate, but it's certainly a good indication that there is a subset of things that you should test on a regular basis that are threat-led, threat-informed, that allow you to have full visibility on how is your partner with ETE able to detect that activity and those threat-based behaviors, and how are you able to better build resilience in your control environment to protect yourself. So in our world, you can run attack simulations super simply, and this is all done by the team at ETE on your behalf. But if I want to run my Windows 11 environment against the top ransomware techniques and stress test the sales or finance or HR, different levels of privilege and role-based access, that is all I need to do this. And then the results will come back in typically about 2 hours, 1.5 hours, something like that, and then mapped back against the MITRE attack framework. Except the way this is done is in a way that pretty much everybody can understand. So traffic light based reporting, where we can really clearly see if we have any defensive capability gaps. And this is the kind of tool where we actually don't want red or yellow. We want everything to be green. And just like your if you work in an office building, in the reception area, probably somewhere, is a control panel full of little green and red LED lights that probably show the status of fire sensors or smoke alarm sensors. And hopefully this will all be green. And we test these on a Thursday or Friday morning at 11 o'clock or whatever your office does. And we're not setting the building on fire, we're simulating smoke and heat. And what the health and safety team or the fire protection team are looking for is a dashboard full of green LEDs. So if there's a single red one, they want to understand where is that red LED, whose office or what floor is that on. It's exactly the same thing for cyber defense, that Validato is bringing in this almost real-time visibility or regular visibility on resilience against particular threats. So these are the ones that you want to maybe present to executive stakeholders to say that we are, testing our infrastructure against these threats on a regular basis, and we've remediated things to have better visibility on detection. So in my little test environment, this isn't E2E's environment, by the way, this is our test environment, which is not entirely configured and optimized because we want to show some bad things. So what I'm actually seeing here from a detection perspective is that while we may detect initial access, but I'm going to assume for the purpose of today's call that initial access will be granted or gained whatever we do. So here it's talking about exploitation of user accounts, but I'm just going to assume that maybe you have a connected supplier or there are other influences that would cause somebody to gain access to the environment. And what it's showing me here is that there are some really standard functions within Windows that are targeted by adversaries that we are currently not fully able to detect. And if I switch this view over to the protection side, also on the protection side. So what we want to do and what the E2E team are doing on your behalf is constantly testing these type of capabilities to make sure that detections are optimized, that the right log data relating to Windows and the generation of scheduled task-based activity is sent to the SIEM and to the analytics platforms so that alerts and alarms can be raised to identify strange behavior in the sales team, using scheduled task or PowerShell or other tools. Why is there somebody in sales using obfuscation technologies, for instance, around data? Is that normal? Is it not normal? So this is ultimately what we're here to do, is to constantly, on a quarterly, monthly, whatever your cadence should be, but certainly more often than a standard, maybe once a year pen test type thing, stress test the key threats that you care about. Some organizations have got cyber threats already listed in their corporate risk registers. So if they're there, absolutely, you should be testing those cyber threats and risks on a regular basis, and ultimately get to green. And so, just like your fire dashboard in the reception area of a building, we want to make sure that all of our risk indicators are green. And in my test environment here, I'm far from perfect. We do some things to make them perfect, but ultimately we're looking for green here. And we actually don't want to have yellow or red. We want to make it green and then keep it green. And then we're going to have a really high degree of confidence that we're going to be resilient against not just today's threat, but anything that comes tomorrow as well. So I'll stop sharing my screen, Dom, if that's okay, but back to you.
Great stuff, Ronan. I think everyone can see how powerful it is and that kind of how useful it is to kind of surface areas which may, which kind of, giving businesses the right focus priority, and obviously keeping, our detections and analytics for our client base right where they need to be based on what the kind of current threat environment looks like. So in terms of how we kind of look at this and kind of incorporating into, making our clients, the toughest possible target we can be, referring back to that pyramid of pain earlier, we've taken that pyramid of pain model and we've made it a much more holistic view, because while the pyramid of pain looks at detections, and that's what we've kind of put on the first row of this table here, so we've still got the same trivial to tough hierarchy, and the detection indicators is what the pyramid of pain talks about. We're also ensuring that those detections are deployed across your entire attack surface, because you can have the best detections and most sophisticated detections, but if it's only across 60 to 70% of your attack surface, there's 30 to 40% for the attacker to hide in, and they will find it and they will do so. Attack disruptions we talked about earlier, it's a measure of time. The sooner you can detect and contain those attacks, the better. Obviously, and we want to get all our customers as down to we operate a 15-minute mean time to detect. So once we've identified something as a alert comes in, we've got 15 minutes to detect if it's a true or false positive, if it comes in with a critical severity level. And then obviously the score posture tools, attack surface reduction tools. Obviously, the Microsoft score is a good one as a reference. You need to be kind of looking at 65% or above to kind of keep making sure your environments and your cloud and all your settings are hardened to the appropriate level. And obviously, there's the bottom row then, testing simulations, what we've been talking about today. If you kind of really want to keep yourself tuned and up to date, you want to be trying to get to at least quarterly where you can. Obviously, if you can do continuous, maybe weekly, etc., then you kind of really kind of at the cutting edge. But yeah, there is these kind of the Validato platform kind of gives that opportunity to kind of get to that level. Certainly, quarterly detection and simulation runs are very much much more easier with this kind of technology in place. So, how do we use this? How does this kind of feature then in kind of building this kind of keyword which we talk about in security operations resilience? Obviously, we start off. We need to do regular attack simulation and response testing, but how does that feed a continuous cycle of improvement? Obviously, we take the output of that, as Ronan talked to, in terms of we talk about what do we need to do for remediation and mitigation. So once we've identified what the high risk coverage and response process gaps based on the current threat environment, we then can put that into a plan in terms of what needs to happen for a remediation plan, what does a new baseline need to be. And then obviously over time, while we're preparing for the next run of testing, we kind of look at what's happening in the current threat environments, and making sure that kind of we're building the next test scenarios that we kind of saw in the platform, getting that making sure it's tuned for a particular client's threat environment accordingly. And this does and that kind of cycle gives really good infrastructure level cyber resilience. But also what it does is it kind of builds the business's operational teams kind of. They get obviously used to kind of understanding what could happen if if these kind of gaps are not covered, what might that have led to, and kind of reduces the kind of the sensitivity to high pressure situations, meaning that people kind of stay in control if a threat does happen. And kind of gets over time, just increases that default level of competence. So yeah, another view on that then is, as I kind of before I kind of hand back, is so we wrap this up in something we call breach disruption validation. So you can hear about traditional things like crisis management simulations, tabletop exercises, but they're very much kind of paper-based what-if scenarios. Running this an actual kind of attack simulation exercises based on the real kind of MITRE attack-based threats, based on real threat actor competences, taking the output of that and running the what-if scenarios on that. Obviously, that kind of regularly running that process will make sure you've got a good view of all your assets and your data sources, and your detections and disruption coverage are kind of where they need to be. But also, obviously, it sparks conversations. What might you need to do with your infrastructure, like segmentation, your communication escalation path, where they need to be. Did everyone understand what they needed to do? And regulatory compliance, there's lots coming in. We're going to talk a bit more to that in terms of how do we take those guidelines and make sure that it's not just a checkbox exercise, but it's actually delivering kind of real resilience for the business. Ronan, in terms of what you're kind of seeing and how that fits in with the bigger requirement for these resilience and regulatory exercises, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think we made the point at the beginning of the session today that the raft of new cyber resilience regulations that are coming in or have already come in the last 12 months are really shifting the onus from this assessment-based audit type level of compliance to much more of a continuous threat-led compliance. There's language in DORA and in the UK cyber security and resilience draft bill so far that talks about things like threat-led penetration testing and have you understood what your threat landscape looks like? How do you stress test your environment on a regular basis to be resilient and operationally resilient to disruption from a cyber perspective? We've seen, very unfortunately, in the retail sector, how a cyber digital incident to essentially an e-commerce arm of a physical retailer can create widespread operational cost and disruption. And so it's not just a technical resilience thing. It is a business operational thing, and stress testing and building in these tests on a regular basis should be part of your resilience strategy, but also your cyber defense strategy. And I think there are many providers out there who provide similar services to ETE, but the ability to have visibility on the relevant log data to create the right relevant alerts relating to threat-based activities is going to be really critical within this whole regulatory and legislative environment going forward. So continuous compliance versus point-in-time compliance, I think, is the key driver in the next 12 to 18 months, I would say, with this.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. I think, indeed, there's a lot of change and certainly raising the bar from the upcoming regulation. Obviously, we want to support and guide the industry and our customers obviously through that as best we can and make that as painless as possible and as meaningful as possible. So that is kind of the end of the actual slide pack. Got a bit of a question and answer session now. I see some questions coming in. Holly, did you see anything you want to address?
Of course. Yeah, let's start off with Michael's question. Are there any attack simulations for web apps, or is this purely focused on MITRE for the infrastructure? Who would like to take that?
I'll probably take that first, Dom, if you want, and you can maybe come back. So the design point for Validato is ultimately to look at the endpoint rather than apps in particular. So we're not testing particular web or on-premise applications, but more the builds and the configurations of Windows, Linux, and Mac environments, but also how that translates into privilege and identity and access management, but not so much from a data workspace document kind of level, but more on a functional level within Windows. So what we actually find is that even within deployments of Windows 11, which are obviously happening for most organizations around now or have recently happened or will happen, we see a lot of IT teams still deploying quite powerful Windows functions that adversaries are specifically targeting and can find within seconds of compromising a user profile, a user account. It is those things that we're trying to call out. So are there opportunities to harden environments? Are there opportunities to identify overprivileged users that go beyond traditional content and data-based PAM and IAM solutions, so functional overprivilege, if you like, and also how is the EDR system environment working? So what is protecting that endpoint environment? Is it tuned and configured to the optimum way for that customer environment and the threat landscape that they operate in? So that's the kind of design scope of Validato, if you like. So we're overlaying threat, so that threat-informed view of that filter, if you like, and just trying to identify, should we harden? Are there overprivileged users? do we need to do something about the EDR? How are we detecting? Do we have visibility on threat-based activities in those environments? Dom, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I mean, that's as you say. I mean, obviously, what we're focusing on here is just kind of living off the land, lateral movement, privilege escalation type threats. In terms of AppSec, which I think is what Michael's referring to, obviously, the different avenues we could take for specific AppSec testing if there's a requirement there. So if that's a need, obviously, please do reach out and we can talk about how we could potentially support that. But yeah, this is very much about that kind of what's happening on the endpoint, but what that kind of throws up in our environment. Obviously, depending on if we are providing a service for you, and it's one of our threat detection response services, and we've got multiple detection vectors in place, so not just on the endpoint, but if we've got network detection response, and we kind of got the security log analytics kind of correlating different things together, when the attack simulation is running, other areas of our infrastructure, our detection environment may pick up lateral movement, for example, across the network. So there's kind of multiple factors in terms of the way that gets detected. Obviously, it will show up in the Validato platform. It may also trigger alerts into our SOC to say it looks like there's some lateral movement going on. And obviously we know well, if it's us running it, we know that's the case. Customers may want to use that to test our environment to see if we do pick up on that as well.
Just to that point, by the way, Dom, one of the most commonly exploited functions of Windows to gain lateral movement and exploit it is a function that probably most people on today's call are quite familiar with, called Remote Desktop Protocol, or RDP, and it's quite often a forgotten benign thing that companies might allow contractors and third parties limited access to certain parts of their environment. But it is, again, one of the first things that many adversaries will target. So it's not just Validato saying this, is the NCSC. If you look at their ransomware resilience advice, I think RDP is probably at the top of that list. Make sure that is restricted and only authorized on a case-by-case basis and all these kind of things. So, but there are a lot of tips and tricks that you could do that don't cost any additional money in order to harden and restrict functions that could be or would be manipulated by adversaries.
Shafali, was there any more questions? Sorry.
Yes, we've just got one more that we'd like to really quickly cover, if that's okay, which is just if an organisation is already running pen testing and red teaming, is something like breach disruption validation still needed?
I'll give a first view on that, and I'll hand over to you, Ronan. So I would say yes. So this does not replace pen testing, red teaming. I would say it's very much complementary to. A red teaming exercise tends to work like an attacker in terms of finding sophisticated ways to kind of get initial access as a starting point, and they'll really kind of put under pressure all the kind of training and the social engineering exercises, and that's where a lot of the kind of the innovation sits with the kind of the attack provider. So we talked about the initial access brokers. The kind of red teaming aspect is kind of really kind of focusing on that, and that's where a lot changes. In terms of the affiliates doing the kind of lateral movement, privilege escalation, living off the land techniques, this is kind of where the Validato platform really shines. So yeah, pen test, red teaming tends to be a once-a-year exercises, and they'll kind of very much kind of test, can we get in, and then once we're in, how far can we get? How far they can get is very much the Validato platform, but yeah, this is kind of something that allows you to run on a much more frequent basis, a lot simpler, and obviously a lot kind of less expensive than your typical high sophisticated red team exercises. Ronan, is there something you would like to add to that?
I would agree with everything you just said. I would just reinforce it by saying that although we're an offensive testing automation platform, and we do simulate adversarial behavior, really I think our core use case is on the blue team, the cyber defense side. So what we want to make blue teams and managed security operations teams like ETEs, or even a combined team where you have your own internal resources, is to better prepare you for different cyber threat scenarios, to build in that resilience. So we absolutely need to be tested also. So I think we see red teaming as a less frequent, because they are more complex, they're more expensive, but they're also human based. And the thing that a red team can do that we can't do, we're digital only, for instance, we're very strictly ethical and legal only also. So there are potential other options that red teams are able to do. But ultimately, a security team that has a well-used Validato environment where you're testing maybe the top 3 or 5 threat scenarios on a regular basis, and your indicators or risk indicators are green, you should be pretty confident that you can bring a red team in and you're still going to be green. They may find 1 or 2 small things, but they're not going to find a plethora of problems and issues that that can take you down. So ultimately, they live side by side. I think penetration tests, it's a very widely defined category, but traditionally we're not involved in identifying vulnerabilities and trying to exploit them. We are assuming that vulnerabilities will be exploited and initial access for the most part will be gained, and it should not be game over even if somebody's inside your network. So we want to improve visibility within the ETE SOC to see this strange activity in our environment, but we also want to restrict it and put measures in place so that adversaries are disrupted from being successful throughout their kill chains.
Just one thing to add to that is obviously you mentioned obviously about a blue team tool, and I mentioned at the beginning of the session about what called detection surface drift. So when you kind of onboard a new kind of SOC operation, when you kind of get your detections in place and you've done your initial testing, over time, 6 months, 12 months, obviously a lot of infrastructure these days is ephemeral. It kind of grows and shrinks on demand. Obviously, you've got users that come and go, and you can get permission creep, and data can become exposed where it's not. So the detections you put in place, maybe 6, 12 months ago, I think it's important that you kind of rerun to make sure as true to life scenario as possible in terms of the kind of purely digital capability that when the kind of attack scenario fires that they were designed for, that they're still working, because any log sources may suddenly kind of become configured not to work in the same way they were intended because something else has changed further down in the infrastructure, and it's change management is there for but it's also sometimes things do get missed, so it's important to rerun or against your existing detections as well as test against new ones.
That's fantastic. Thanks, guys. We have just got one final question to answer in the chat here from Rod. So we use Deep Dark web analysis tool to identify IP addresses where data or assets have been lost. Would it be helpful to Validato to have this early information to assess key endpoints and expedite the remediation?
It's a great question, Rod. I'll start this, Dom, if it's okay, and I'll pass over to you. Because actually, I think this is actually more of a Dom and E2E thing, because actually, weirdly enough, in Validato, it's not that we don't care about abused IP addresses or ones that are used by adversaries. We care deeply about them. It's just that our use cases, in that pyramid of pain, if you like, we're at the TTP level. Because our opinion of those IP addresses is that once they become published, and NCSC, CISA in the US, other threat intelligence services regularly publish advisories with all the IOCs, like IP addresses of threat actors. And indeed, the National Crime Agency took down Lockbit 18 months ago. And a great example of that is that in 2024, even though they were taken down, Lockbit was still the most prevalent ransomware group globally in the last 12 months. So IP addresses in our world can be replaced, maybe multiplied. So it's actually, that's a today radar thing that ETE stock and detection capabilities should be looking at, in our opinion, whereas we're looking at can somebody install remote access software on an internet-facing server? Can they jump into the internal environment and run a PowerShell script or a scheduled task script to run and execute some malware? So could you detect that? Can you stop it? So we're more on the behavioral level, but I think, Dom, I think your team lives in a world of identifying IOCs, so maybe you have a better input on that.
Yeah, I'm going to take a different view on that question. I'm going to so maybe perhaps if we read it in terms of the IP address endpoints of users that may have been compromised. So in a lot of kind of dark web monitoring tools, what you can see is when credentials have been kind of compromised through info stealers, you kind of see who that user is, and you can kind of map that back to who where their endpoint sits in the corporate network, or so if that's the case, you can kind of then what user group does that user belong to? So maybe if it's someone from sales, for example, then maybe it's worth then running a scenario on demand against the sales user profile specific to the threat actor that you can see that's kind of got those credentials. And obviously in a lot of dark web monitoring platforms, you can see if those have been sold, who's trading in those assets, who's the threat actor that might be buying them, build a scenario specific to that, and the TTPs that they use to make sure that you can detect, and if there's any gaps specific to that, you put remediation measures in place before that happens, kind of predictive.
I would 100% agree with that. Yeah, I think we're running out of time as well, but I think the whole info stealer and the ability to bypass traditional authentication, particularly compromising home devices, is hugely challenging for security teams right now. But to that point, exactly, identify the roles of the users and see how far, doing a what if analysis on how far could they get and damage our organization if they were compromised. So Rod, if I misunderstood your question, I think that's absolutely how you could use Validato.